I have a couple of people with me here today, people that I'm proud to have known and worked with in the past. This is Ben Thrash from the University of Arkansas. He's the extension entomologist. He took my place. And so
nobody can take your place, guys.
Oh yeah, pretty easily. It's like that finger in a bucket of water do. But and right here beside me is a Chase Floyd from the University of Missouri. He's the extension entomologist in the Boot Hill, and we worked together too for quite a few years. And now he's up in the Boot Hill doing big things for the growers up there. So we're proud of his progress and where he's at. And today we're going to talk about bugs and bottom line. So, one of the things we really want to get into with some detail is in a few weeks we're going to start putting squares on, and we're going to start, that's the time when we really have to be concerned about plant bugs. And that's the biggest thing I wanted to talk about today was the plant bug situation and how we approach control and what goes into to making that decision on when it's time to make an application. And so, most of the work that we did in the last several years has been, there was a time when all the entomologists, when we looked across the Mid-South, everybody had a different threshold for plant bugs. Mississippi's threshold was different from Arkansas, was different from Louisiana. And so
some people recommended sampling with a sweep net, and some people recommended sampling with a drop cloth.
Yeah. So we had a lot of disagreement on how you approach plant bugs. And this was at a time when we had got through boll weevil eradication and we'd removed boll weevil from the equation, and then the Bogard cotton came on and it was helping us control worms. And so the plant bugs quickly moved into that niche and became the number one pest of cotton at that time. So there was a lot of questions out there and not a lot of agreement amongst the different states in the Mid-South about how you approach plant bug control. So we decided as a Mid-South group, and that was Angus Catchot and Jeff Gore and Don Cook and Scott Stewart in Tennessee and me and Glenn Studebaker here in Arkansas, and we got together and decided we needed to come to some agreement on not only what the threshold was, but how to sample. Is a sweep net better than a shake sheet, or what? And when do we spray? Is it one per row foot, or one per 3 row feet, or one per whatever? Mm-hmm. And so we started doing a lot of work together as a group, and that's how the Mid-South Entomologist Working Group came to be over plant bugs.
Right.
Yeah. And we were able to Fred down in Mississippi, he was kind of the ringleader. He was the research guy, and the rest of us were the extension folks that all came together and decided on some protocols to approach looking at what our threshold is. And there's a reason why we have a threshold that we have, and it was based on a lot of data. We had 3 locations in Arkansas, and they had a couple of locations in Mississippi, and one in Tennessee, and one in Louisiana, and all that data went together as a group. And Fred Musser crunched all that number, all the numbers on it, and that's how we came up with a threshold that's uniform across the Mid-South, right?
Yep.
And that threshold is 3 per 5 row feet on a shake sheet, right?
Yep, for nymphs.
And
on there,
9 to 12 on per 100 sweeps on with a sweep net on pre-blooming cotton. And that's part of the work that we did using those tools. We found out from our data that you use a sweep net on pre-blooming soybean or cotton, and when you get to the bloom stage, then you switch over to the shake sheet. Now, there's still a lot of people we were talking about this earlier that don't make a transition, but our recommendation is that you make that transition to a shake sheet when you get to bloom stage, and if you're still using a sweep net, then what we can tell you is that it's not as efficient for catching nymphs
Right.
as it is the sweep net's the shake sheet's much better than the sweep net.
Right.
When we transition to that stage and we have a lot of nymphs in the field. So that's why we make that recommendation. And you got any input in that?
So early in the season when all those adults are moving into the field, sweep net is a lot better pre-bloom. But to pick up those nymphs, just a drop cloth does so much better than a sweep net. And we're actually trying to do a little work on that, on some of the new technology, some of the Thrive on cotton. We're doubling the threshold for the nymphs on the Thrive on cotton. You can't just forget about spraying plant bugs on the Thrive on, but you are able to double that threshold from 3 plant bug nymphs per fibro feet to 6 plant bug nymphs per fibro feet in the Thrive on. So that's a little bit of a change, and that's some work. I think we got close to 20 locations so far on that trial, and so we're pretty confident in that. One thing that did come out of the work y'all did trying to figure out the plant bug threshold too was that 80% square retention.
Yeah, that's a critical part of it.
Yeah,
there's a lot of people that think that say they have zero tolerance for plant bugs, and that's just not the way it needs to be. A little bit of plant bug activity out there and a little bit of square loss is not necessarily a bad thing, is it?
No, it's not. I mean, that was something I was going to bring up earlier, so you could talk about that data that little bit more. But I've been telling our consultants, like, hey, double that threshold on Thrive On, and they're skeptical about it because what they're saying is they're seeing a yield drag. It's just not yielding like those Bollgard 3 varieties.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that, but then I try to show them the data that we've done, and that damage. That extra damage from those extra plant bugs being out there, we're seeing that increase.
Yeah, we're getting a little bit of a yield bump from knocking a few squares off. I mean, you lose a few squares and you tend to get a boost in yield. I mean, it's pretty common.
The overcompensation, and we showed it very clearly in our data when we were doing that work.
Yeah,
and we came up with. There's a reason we set the threshold at 80% square retention.
Right. And after you drop below 80%, your yield can drop off pretty quick after that. So you want to maintain at least that. But I mean, losing a few, I think, if you're maintaining 85% square retention, you're going to get probably a better yield than you are maintaining 100. I mean, it's pretty common.
And with a year like it is this year, with the cost of production and the low price of the commodity, this is a time when you really need to pay attention to that threshold that we worked on so hard to come up with to help the growers maintain their profit.
Right. And, that kind of goes back to another thing. What we like to use early in the season is we typically run like a neonicotinoid. We run imidacloprid or Centric is a lot of what we use. And then we'll typically transition into something like Transform early in the season, trying to preserve our beneficial insects as long as possible. The longer we can preserve those beneficial insects, the better. Sometimes you can preserve them as long as you can, and then sometimes you just got to bite the bullet.
Sometimes you got to go.
Yeah.
When it's time to go, it's time to go.
Yeah.
Right. When you got to spray, you got to spray.
Right. So,
and you don't hesitate. You can't do that. You can't try to spare the beneficials. Sometimes you just got to clean house.
Right. That's what.
And in these years when plant bug numbers are heavy, what we found in the past was that you want to go into lap canopy closure. You got to have control of those plant bugs before you get there. And if you don't have control of those plant bugs, you're never going to get them under control
Right.
if you don't get them done, if you don't get them out of there before you go into canopy closure.
Yeah, because
That
you're
was a
just
big
not getting
thing.
good insecticide penetration down there in that lapped up canopy. And that's a big issue. And you've been doing some work on those drop nozzles, and you've seen a huge increase in control with some of those drop nozzles just because coverage is such a
Right.
big issue.
Yeah. And I mean, even so, I mean, we're going to do some tip work on it too.
Mm-hmm.
The idea would be if you were running like a flat fan on both sides of that nozzle plus one over the top, you should get a better coverage. Now, I was just doing this with a hollow cone last year, so
Mhm.
it was kind of like a fogger, right?
Yeah.
But we were getting so much, canopy coverage there. We were able to take those lower end products like the acephate, the ones that we're not seeing the efficacy that we've seen in the past, increasing that by 25 to 33%.
Yeah.
So we're going to continue
That's
to
big.
keep working
Yeah.
on that.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And that just coverage is a huge issue when it comes to spraying plant bugs
And this
cotton.
this
That
three
just
nozzle
shows that.
thing, you realize that's nothing new, right?
Right.
I mean, if you go back long enough in time, there was a time when we were advocating for those three nozzles to give us control. Back in the day, it was aphids were giving us fits, and they're on the undersides of leaves, so it was a big time adjustment for a little while, and then
Yeah.
those things kind of, when we got some
Yeah.
products that began to work a lot
Yeah.
better, that went away. But that's
Right. And speed is definitely your biggest issue, right? Like these growers are moving at high speed planters, high speed sprayers. They
Yeah.
don't want to move at the pace that it takes to run that type of technology and that type of equipment. But particularly if we can get, especially like in scenarios where we're next to corn,
Mhm.
and we're going to have a heavier population of ligas when we're right there next to that corn. Maybe we could treat heavy on some edges,
Mhm.
start reducing that population as they're moving out. Maybe we can get them to not distribute across that cotton field so much.
Right.
So,
Yeah. And what we had talked about earlier, though, about preserving our beneficial insects, and trying to use our softer chemistries, our neonics, trying to use like transforms pretty soft before you turn into using acephate plus bifenthrin or bidrin plus bifenthrin. I was actually asking you earlier. I said, how big of an issue were aphids prior to like transform being
Yeah.
released?
back in the day when I first started in the business, we had late season aphids. They were a problem for us at the end of the season, and then all of a sudden aphids changed and they started getting on seedling and small cotton. And I mean, it was like, what's going on?
Yeah.
It was a big transition at that time for them to change their behavior the way they did. But I think it had a lot to do with what was being sprayed and that
Right.
kind of thing, and
Right.
what kind of blew them up. And now we got some tools that are obviously a lot better for control, and
Yeah.
we don't tend to see aphids as bad as what we used to.
Yeah, I mean, I rarely get aphid calls, and I think it is because we're using quite a bit of transform out there, and that's having a big control on them. I tell you, last year we had really light plant bugs, but I think I got more aphid calls last year because I don't think we were spraying our plant bugs.
Not spraying as much.
Yeah. And so that's the first time, like first year, I've really had a lot of aphid calls, I guess.
I mean, I would say I would totally agree with you on that. I mean, my first year in the boot heel, we were averaging about 5 to 6 sprays for plant bugs. Last year, we were closer to 3 or 4. So I think that reduction in application definitely played a role in that. I was able to pick up aphids in
Yeah.
quite a few areas.
Right. Speaking of which, I mean, what are y'all using, Chase? I mean, I kind of know, but what are y'all for foliar?
Intrepid Edge has been what I've been recommending, 3 ounces with a surfactant.
Yeah.
Dynamic works really well in our studies. We've had a lot of allegiance to dicrotophos.
Yeah.
And, some of those thrips assays we've been running, we're starting to see that fail on us.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have been picking up more acres with Intrepid Edge, and folks have been really happy with it. They just, the biggest thing to take away from it is, it may have residual, but 4 to 5 days is you're living right.
Right.
If you're getting a true 4 to 5 days out of an application.
And that surfactant is critical, right?
Yes.
And do y'all recommend any particular type of surfactant? I know you said dynamic, which is a good blend. I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
But-
a lot of people run to NIS with it and have good luck. I don't think anything necessarily in particular. You know, if you're running a herbicide that's got a high surfactant load in it, like a Roundup or a Liberty, with that Intrepid Edge, you don't have to worry about adding any additional surfactant
Right.
to it.
Right.
Yeah. So, anyways, but we've been getting a lot of calls on them, and you got to think about people still wanting to go out with Bidrin or acephate out there on them. We got pretty widespread resistance across the state, and we're having really poor luck with our organophosphate insecticides for control of thrips. And so that's kind of why our only option right now to get good control is the Intrepid Edge. Now it seems like down in the farther south you go, down in South Arkansas, we seem to get a little bit better control with the organophosphates, but it's still kind of hit or miss down there. And like we've always said, the most expensive insecticide application is the one that doesn't work. So
Yeah.
not a lot of other options.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we've got a really heavy thrips population this year, but we also annually put ourselves in not the best situations because we've got so much sand content in our soil. We have so much sandblasting. We're running candy boxes in between the hippers and planting wheat middles, and we're not given enough time to terminate that wheat. And I try to mention green bridge situations like that, but when you've got something green out there, and it's really the only thing green out there, and then you terminate it, and then here comes the next green thing, what's going to happen? So we battle it. We battle thrips pressure and insect pressure a lot because we have to have that wheat in the middles for the sandblasting.
Right.
And some of those products that you mentioned, that people are trying to use on thrips can actually cause you some other problems, right?
Absolutely. That's probably anytime that I'm talking with a consultant or a grower about what we need to be doing in terms of an application, the number one question I get in that conversation is this going to clear mites? We're seeing a lot of early season mites. Typically, we're not going aggressive enough with the burn down, not getting it cleaned up. In that first post application, we're trying to clean those weeds up, and they're moving right onto that early, seedling cotton, and we're getting a lot of damage there. So typically, especially in the boot heel where they're extremely conducive, we're always talking about these applications and what we can do not to flare mites. And, with dicrotophos and acephate and things like that, we are always running a risk of flaring them up.
Yeah.
So,
And definitely don't want to spray a pyrethroid. There's a lot of people that like to throw a pyrethroid in. That's not a good idea at all.
No, that's just asking to flare spider mites.
Yeah.
But I mean, as far as thrips go, I guess that's kind of what's going on right now.
When it comes to insecticides that you recommend to growers and consultants at that time, particularly around the first week of bloom, right in that change in that transition from cotton going to bloom, and that's when we really got to get the best level of control. So do you have any recommendations for what growers use at that time, or do you make suggestions to them on what might be best for control?
Typically, what I'm suggesting is that we hold that transform application till bloom. A lot of the time, and in certain scenarios, these consultants feel like they can't get these plant bugs under control, and they trigger that application a little early, maybe into the third week of squaring, going into the fourth week of squaring. Typically, when that happens, we get to the end of the year and we just don't have a lot of budget left. Where we can control those shorter plants with a different chemistry and trying to save that for that bloom application is what we recommend. Now, we don't always get there. Of course, it depends on the scenario. But I do feel like these consultants that make these applications to transform at that bloom timing when they're hitting that threshold seem to have a lot more success with control, as well as it seems like they can have a good regime going into bloom to keep those plant bugs under control. It kind of gets us out of a playing field that we can start to adapt and change chemistries and rotate, because we're not letting those plant bug numbers really blow too terribly high back up.
Yeah, I mean, whenever I'm really trying to go after plant bugs and I'm going to compare it to anything else, my choice is usually about 2 ounces of transform with 6 ounces of diamond. That's probably my hammer. That's the best.
That's when you
common
want to
treatment.
get them out of the field, right?
Yeah, that's when you're under some heavy pressure, and nothing else really compares to that right now. Because you get some residual out of the transform that you don't really see with our organophosphates. You tend to get a little bit better residual. I see, and a common question I get is going back to back with transform, and we saw that for years. Was that if 2 applications of transform back to back seemed to do really good.
And when we looked at the yield results from that, we were definitely seeing an increase in yield where we used transform in that system. Seemed like it was about 150, 200 pounds a lot of times in our plots. We'd see a pretty good yield increase with it.
Yeah. And that's, something else we want to talk about is trying to change your chemistry up. I mean, we want to try to preserve that chemistry as long as possible. I think the label says you can make 2 back-to-back applications of transform. You can make 4 total for the year, but you can only make 2 back-to-back, and then you're supposed to swap it to another insecticide before you go back with transform if you're going to end up using it again. But even though transform's so good, you need to rotate to our acephate bifenthrin. You need to use some bidrin. You need to use a different chemistry just so we aren't building resistance. Tyler down at Mississippi State, he's been running some assays on transform, trying to see compared to the baseline whenever this chemical is introduced, if we do have any resistance built up to it. And so far, he hadn't found anything. We're sending him populations every year.
That's a big thing.
We're
not seeing any loss in control over all the time that we've had transform.
Yeah.
And I think that's maybe, when you compare transform to some other products like acephate and a pyrethroid or bidrin and we see pretty much. It looks like the controls are not, they don't separate statistically, but at the end of the year. And that's what, that was the issue when transform came on, or a lot of people were like, oh yeah, I would use transform, but it's cost more. But you're getting something for that.
You are.
For that cost.
You're getting your money.
You're getting a better level of control, and maybe maintaining that yield potential on that cotton crop that's what we're shooting for.
Yeah.
We don't grow cotton to spray bugs. That's not the deal. We're trying to get some economic control, and the bottom line is what really is most important to the producer and the consultant. So I can overlook a little bit more cost if it's making me cotton.
Right.
And that's right. That's it. Right.
Yeah. And not flaring your spider mites, making you have another application for those too. I mean, it's a system that's got to all work together to try to reduce your number of apps that you got to have. And
as you start opening up the pocketbook for miticide applications, you're going to get your feelings hurt very quickly.
Right.
Those are expensive, and a lot of the time they're not effective unless we've got our carrier volume up or other things like that. That it's a big adjustment if we have to go into trying to get mites under.
Yeah, and then you got to protect for them way on past any other insect pest. So,
and that issue that you brought up earlier with your drop nozzles and that kind of thing. I mean, all the insecticides are critical to get good coverage, and there's ways to do that the drop nozzle thing sounds really good, especially when you're getting 25, 30% additional control with some insecticides. But getting your volume where it needs to be and getting enough pressure to get that stuff down in the canopy, because that's where the plant bugs live, right?
Mhm.
They're down in the canopy, and that's why it's so important to get control before canopy closure. But if you're at canopy closure and you got a treat, you want to make sure that application is the best it can be and that you're getting penetration.
Yeah. That's
down
why
in
we
that
always
canopy.
run the holocones instead of running, if you need to run like something like a holocone instead of running like a really coarse tip, if you're really going to get good coverage with your insecticides.
And that most of the time when I get a call and a product they are claiming has failed or not, they're not seeing the efficacy. Once we go through the 20 questions, figuring it out, it most of the time got tank mixed with a herbicide and they were running a coarse drop.